No blast crater. Now that we are fully informed, we can take a look at the real problem. One of the major anomalies pointed out by many skeptics is the absence of any form of blast crater below the engine of the descent stage of the lunar lander. In fact, on the photographs, there is very little evidence of any disturbance of the ground on any of the Apollo missions. The skeptics point out that the descent stage rocket was rated at 10,500 pounds thrust, and that this would have made a sizable blast crater as the lunar lander touched down, or at the minimum, would have removed all of the fine dust from the area of the landing. We have now established above that, according to NASA, the thrust that we are dealing with is only about 3,500 pounds thrust, not the engine's maximum thrust of 10,500 pounds, so the skeptics are exaggerating the situation somewhat. The fact that the engine would be throttled back as it approached the moon's surface is logical, and I guess essential if you want to land and don't want to play bouncy castles on the moon. The skeptics point to many of the Apollo photographs showing astronauts' boot prints in the fine dust, some almost under the lunar module descent stage. Also, remember that Neil Armstrong made a good footprint at the boot of the ladder when he first stepped off and uttered the now iconic,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
He must have stood just about 16 feet from the center of the descent engine, or merely 3 feet away from the edge of our calculated blast area. The skeptics contend that this proves that the fine dust had not been blown away by the descent engine, which is something that perhaps would have been entirely expected. Many of them postulate that the lunar lander was never actually landed, but lowered by a gantry crane on some studio set here on Earth where the photography was actually done. Jara White, one of the prolific skeptics, gives us a typical view of what most skeptics say in a 5-part series on YouTube, and another in a similar vein by Chris D. Byrne. In the second video, Chris shows a 1988 NASA film, Scaled Lunar Model Jet Erosion Experiments. These NASA experiments used test models on various types of lunar soil and did demonstrate that a blast crater could well have been made by the descent engine. The possibility that NASA considered that there may be a blast crater can be seen from this transcript of Neil Armstrong reporting to NASA Mission Control shortly after the successful landing on Apollo 11.
Descent engine did not leave a crater of any size. It has about 1 foot clearance on the ground. We're essentially on a very level place here. I can see some evidence of rays emanating from the descent engine, but very insignificant amount.
Furthermore, Armstrong comments as he places his foot on the lunar surface that,
although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it, it's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine.
Keep in mind where Armstrong was standing when he said this, at the foot of the lunar module ladder, as he previously noted. It is obvious that the descent engine had to be stopped before or shortly after touchdown, otherwise the lunar module may rise again and cycle through some bouncy stages. In Apollo 11, Buzz Aldrin gives the following narrative as the lunar module lands.
Contact light.
This implies that the engine was only switched off after the lunar lander's probes had touched the ground and the contact lights illuminated. In the video by Jara White, investigating the blast crater anomaly, astronaut Eugene Cernan, the commander of Apollo 17, explains that there was no blast crater because the engines were shut off when the lunar module was about 10 feet from the lunar surface. To double-check what he said, he was asked whether this would have been the same for Apollo 11, to which Cernan replied, yes. The lunar module weighed 32,400 pounds on Earth, so only 5,400 pounds equivalent on the Moon, or about 2¼ tons in old money. The skeptics ask you to imagine throwing a Ford Transit van out of your bedroom window and then expecting a soft landing. On both the lunar landing videos for Apollo 11 and Apollo 17, the audio clearly shows that the engine was switched off after touchdown, and it was the same for all other Apollo missions. It was remarkable then, and most surprising, that Eugene Cernan would have got this wrong. After all, he was one to switch the engine off after touchdown. However, despite the claims of the absence of a blast crater by the skeptics, there are plenty of believers who are eager to explain this imagined anomaly. I will let Amy Shearer Title, presenter of Vintage Space website, explain it to us. A more erudite presentation is given on the Clavius website. Both of our believers see no problem with not having a blast crater, but are less informative about the moon dust remaining so long to the lunar lander's legs. Remember, Neil Armstrong stood in it and specifically commented on it. Moon dust. Moon dust, more properly known as regolith, which simply means the layer of unconsolidated solid material covering the bedrock of a planet. On Earth we call it soil. We have dealt above with a blast crater or lack of it, but what about the moon dust? The skeptics state that even if the lunar lander didn't create a crater when it landed, it would have blown away all of the loose dust surrounding the landing site, but looking at the photographs in the Apollo missions, there is clearly lots of loose dust and small rocks underneath the lunar lander. The skeptics question, how could this be? They point out that there is little evidence of a blast crater, but perhaps more importantly, there is little evidence of the fine dust that has been dispersed by the rocket engine. Remember, the fine dust which Neil Armstrong said was present at the foot of the ladder. We know from the lunar landing videos that the lunar lander did kick up some dust, as Buzz Aldrin reports, picking up some dust as the lunar lander approached touchdown, and you can see that something like dust momentarily blurs out the moon's features. It is possible that the lunar lander did disperse a lot of dust, but perhaps it didn't disperse all of it if the dust was deep at the landing point. So then what you see under the lunar lander is the residual dust. It is possible. How probable, I have no idea. Certainly, with no atmosphere, the dust is easier to move as there is no air pressure acting down on it. There are two factors which affect how dust would behave. Firstly, with no atmosphere, the dust will settle down more quickly than on Earth, as it does not suspend in the air as there is a vacuum on the moon. But secondly, there is 1/6 gravity on the moon. It would fall much slower than here on Earth. How these two factors would affect the actual speed of falling is not quite clear, although the believers imagine it would fall much quicker as it is not suspended in the air. The lunar module lander had a diameter of 31 feet to the edge of the supporting legs. The diameter of the descent skirt was 4 foot 6 inches, and we can assume that the blast diameter of the rocket engine at touchdown was at least about twice the size, let's say 9 feet. This means that Neil Armstrong's first steps on the lunar soil was 11 feet from the edge of the rocket blast area, and he reported that he made a very striking impression into the dusty surface. The skeptics argue that even with the low pressure of a leaf blower, this dust, very, very fine-grained, almost like a powder, Neil Armstrong's words, would have been blown away. The believers point out that NASA clearly shows photographs showing the descent engine nozzle and the ground beneath it. They ask, why would NASA deliberately take pictures that fail to show a blast crater if there should be one? They also say that there is much confusion about the lunar dust, which seems to arise from people thinking of household dust. Household dust is mostly organic, human hair and dead skin for the most part. It has a low density and floats easily in the air on Earth. Lunar dust is powdered rock, much higher in density, and with no air to support it, it falls immediately to the ground. The believers say that when the astronauts walk on the moon, you can see in the videos that the dust is kicked up, doesn't hang in a cloud, but plummets literally like a stone, as here is no air to keep it suspended. Almost everybody assumes that the lunar lander came down vertically, and therefore any blast crater would be immediately below the engine skirt. Now, just maybe, we have been looking for the blast crater in the wrong place. Perhaps it should not be immediately below the engine skirt as everybody seems to think, as this video by Hunchbacked explains. As the lunar lander is seen to have a lateral movement just before it landed, then the rocket engine would have needed to be gimbaled toward the direction of the motion in order to stop this lateral movement. Remember that the lunar lander had no wheels, so it needed to land vertically, otherwise it may have tipped over when the first leg hit the ground. Hunchbacked provides a very plausible explanation of why any blast crater may not be below the descent engines, and shows the Apollo 11 photograph to illustrate this theory. All the more interesting as Hunchbacked is supposed to be a skeptic. My fellow traveler, you have heard the evidence from the skeptics and the counter-arguments from the believers. What do you think? Do you think that the lunar lander should have made a sizable crater as it landed, or none at all? Or perhaps whether there was a crater or not is not that relevant. The question may be, is it feasible that where Neil Armstrong first stepped onto the surface, just 11 feet from the rocket blast area, that the moon dust should be so deep and that his iconic boot impression was at least 1 inch deep? I will leave you to ponder that before we examine other impressions in the sand and then finally the blast-off from the moon. Boot prints. We have already established that there is no atmosphere on the moon, so any impressions made in the lunar regolith are likely to remain for a very long time. This includes any disturbance of the regolith from the astronauts walking and hopping about as we see continually on the NASA videos. In the later Apollo missions, we also have the lunar rover churning up the ground as it motored around the lunar surface. It is though that these impressions in the sand are likely to remain for hundreds, thousands, or even millions of years until impacted by some stray rocky visitor from another world. This fact is often presented as being the final proof for the moon landings by both believers and skeptics alike. When man eventually returns to the moon, then all will be clear, but until that time, the next best alternative is to somehow photograph the landing sites. Well, as we shall see, NASA already claims to have done this in 2009 with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter (LRO) and published photographs of what they found. This announcement and the subsequent published photographs, rather than solve the issue, only seem to have added more fuel to the already fiery debate between the believers and the skeptics, as we shall discover. But for now, let us look at some of the problems our skeptics see in these impressions in the sand. There are too many to mention them all, so I have needed to somewhat be selective, but I have attempted to cover the main anomalies as seen by our skeptics. First of all, we have those ambiguous astronaut boot prints. The iconic boot print from Apollo 11 has attracted much attention from our skeptics. They have been surprised that the boot left such a clear and distinct print in the moon dust. It is deep, clear, and crisp. This has attracted significant attention from our skeptics who maintain that to leave such a clear boot print would require the lunar soil to be damp, but there is no moisture on the moon. Ralph Renee was the first to draw attention to this anomaly as described by Jara White. In this video above, Jara refers to the Mythbusters video which was used to prove that the boot print could not have been made here on Earth as most skeptics assert, so to be fair to the Mythbusters, let's look at their presentation. The believers' answer to this dilemma is that the moon regolith is totally different from anything we could find naturally occurring on Earth. The difference is explained on the Clavius website. Basically, there is no corrosion on the moon so that the regolith would be angular and not rounded by the erosion of wind and rain as occurs here on Earth. The believers say that this enables the grains to cluster together and retain the impression of any print, be it boots or tires. Certain manufactured substances on Earth also exhibit the same properties, for example, flour, custard powder, and cement, which will all retain impressions in the absence of moisture. This has led many skeptics to postulate that the moon dust used by NASA was some form of dry cement. Whatever the moon regolith was, it caused big problems for NASA and the astronauts as described by Curious Droid. This substance with its sharp edges was found to be abrasive for equipment and the astronaut suits, whereas other believers have stated that the reason the dust stuck to almost everything it touched is it was due to its angularity, but Curious Droid points out that the dust is electrically charged and that is why it was so sticky. The dust caused the astronauts problems is that it got into the joints of the spacesuit, making it difficult for the astronauts to move their arms and legs. It also badly scoured the face visors, hampering vision, as it was also reported that the dust wore through 3 layers of the Kevlar-like materials on Jack Schmidt's moon boots. Jara White continues his assessment of moon prints and tries his own experiments using moon regolith simulant. In order to conduct his experiment, he imported 25 kilos of the regolith simulant from NASA's own suppliers. This is the same substance as used by the Mythbusters in their proclaimed successful experiment, but Jara was unable to replicate that distinct Apollo boot print. he actually found very little difference between the boot print made in the regolith simulant to that in the normal sand. His conclusion is that the Mythbusters probably cheated. Our skeptics are seeing boot prints all over the place, so let us look at some of the quite paranoid visions some of them have. In July 2015, the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. started a crowdfunding appeal to raise $500,000 to help preserve the spacesuit worn by Neil Armstrong on the moon. Apparently, the spacesuit, supposedly designed to withstand the rigors of extreme solar radiation, drastic changes in temperature, and objects traveling faster than the speed of sound, is not coping very well in the climate-controlled storage in the museum. It now requires $500,000 to save it from perishing. Incredibly, we are told by NASA that the materials chosen to manufacture the spacesuit only had a 6-month lifespan. Amazingly, the Smithsonian managed to raise $719,799 US in just the first month of the appeal. A submission by skeptic Projects cries hoax. He finds it rather surprising that the spacesuit is perishing in the climate-controlled museum, whereas in the UK they still have the clothes worn by Henry VIII 600 years ago, and they could still be worn today. Unfortunately, in what is otherwise a very good video, he makes a rather gigantic mistake, and I can assure you that he was only one of many to make this error. He compares the moon boot print to the soil of Neil Armstrong's shoe from the photograph in the Smithsonian and immediately sees a hoax. This faux pas is also intimated in our next presentation from Kenneth H.M. Farrow. These two skeptics have completely misunderstood the spacesuit's design worn by the Apollo astronauts as explained by Rumble Viral. He points out that the astronauts wore the overboots to provide heat insulation against the hot lunar surface, so comparing Neil Armstrong's shoe pattern to the moon boot print was a nonsense. We have a similar explanation from Para Breakdown. The actual moon overboots were discarded on the moon to save weight on the return journey to Earth. Now we have some final boot print fanciful observations from our skeptics. First of all, we listen to the ideas from Reality Sleuth. In this video, he identifies what he considers to be a strange boot print with curved treads rather than the Apollo boot straight boot print tread pattern. We have a similar identification of a strange boot print from Styles, but this work boot print could simply be one print on top of another. Finally, we have Spy-On1618, who imagines he sees a footprint of a shoe. However, this looks likely to be simply the case of Mr. Spy-On practicing with his newly acquired Photoshop software. Tire tracks! I think that we've had more than enough of boot prints, so let us hear what the skeptics say about the tire tracks. The lunar rover was used on Apollo missions 15, 16, and 17 and left numerous kilometers of tracks to mark its presence. In some NASA photographs, it is often difficult to see any tracks around the lunar rover, leading to the skeptics to question how the rover got to its parked position in the first place. The obvious answer for the skeptics is that it was lowered into position by a crane. Some of the photographs of the lunar rover identified by our skeptics are dubious to say the least, for example these. One point the skeptics make is that there should always be a tire track between the wheels of the rover, but this is not often the case. Naturally, Hunchback has his own view of this. Our believers do not have such problems with rover tracks as witnesses this offering from Bertie Slack, in which he strongly and quite rudely criticizes a skeptic. And among his insults of the skeptic, he does manage to provide some sensible explanation as to why the rover tracks may not always be visible. We have another believer, Astrobrant2, admonishing another skeptic on the subject of not being able to see the tire tracks. In this one, we best skip to 330, as Astrobrant has the unfailingly, seemingly compulsive habit of rambling a bit off the science. Basically, he makes one good point about seeing or not seeing the rover tracks. In places where the regolith is quite deep, the rover's open mesh wheel tires can pick up a significant amount of dust and then dump it back over the track it had just made. Believer Bertie Slack has two more observations on seeing lunar rover tracks. It is a great pity that many of our believers have a predisposition to offer more insults than scientific explanation. It would appear that anyone who happens to have a different view on matters must be an idiot or a moron. I personally find this a rather strange approach to scientific debate. I recall reports of Charles Darwin also being similarly ridiculed by the scientists at the time for his rather crazy offbeat ideas about evolution. Makes one wonder. Finally, on the subject of rover tracks, we have this popular skeptic's anomaly from Paranormal Crucible. The first part of the video covers many of the anomalies that we have seen elsewhere, but at time 337, a sequence of photographs is shown which is intended to suggest that there are rover tracks visible before the lunar rover has even been unpacked, which clearly would be impossible. However, this just demonstrates a misunderstanding of the layout of the cargo bays on the lunar lander. The unopened cargo bay is not the bay the lunar rover was stored in, as that was always stored to the right of the ladder. What you will see there is the cargo bay to the left of the ladder is the unopened mesa table and not the unpacked lunar rover. Blast off from the moon! There is one further anomaly eagerly identified by the skeptics, and that concerns the blast-off from the moon by the ascent stage of the lunar lander. The skeptics point out that in the video of the blast-off from the moon, there is no visible rocket blast from the ascent engine as they would have expected, and that the motion of the ascent does not appear to resemble that one would expect from a rocket initially struggling to overcome gravity. We have the NASA videos of the blast-off from the moon for Apollo 15, Apollo 16, and Apollo 17. If you are feeling concerned that they left to the cameraman on the moon, then I can tell you that these videos were taken by the camera on the lunar rover, which was controlled from NASA on Earth. For both Apollo 16 and 17, the camera on the lunar rover was panned to follow the rising spacecraft. On Apollo 15, the camera does not pan upwards to follow the spacecraft. NASA states that this was due to a technical problem. So now, what did we see? Well, we certainly see a lot of flying debris in the form of colored fragments shooting out when the explosive bolts are blown. These bolts are usually to hold together the descent and ascent stages. In all three videos, there is a small triangular plume positioned on the descent stage which stays visible for about half a second, but then does not follow the spacecraft upwards. There appears to be no plume extending below the spacecraft as it rises. Finally, the skeptics say that the rocket blastoff looks rather unnatural. I am no rocket scientist, but it does appear as though the ascent stage just pops up without any sign of first pause one would expect as it initially overcomes gravity, but let us hear from our skeptics and believers on this matter. We will let Jarrah White outline the problem as he sees it. In Jarrah's view of the claim by the believers that the propellants used in the ascent stage rocket would not give a visible plume is not true, and he compares this to a video footage of the Apollo 9 mission. True believer Brant Watson has a ready answer to Jarrah's problems. Unlike Jarrah, Brant Watson clearly sees a plume, but rather unfortunately cannot resist his usual intelligence-insulting manner and compares Jarrah to Forrest Gump. Again, I find this approach by Brant Watson to a scientific debate rather strange. If you don't agree with someone, that is just fine. Simply explain how you consider that they are wrong. His approach is, because someone may have another view different from his own, forget the science and just call them stupid. For me, this just totally weakens Brant Watson's arguments. As we would expect, other believers are eager to join in the debate. Amy Shearer Title from the Vintage Space website confusses the issue slightly, as unlikely fellow believer Astrobrant 2, she sort of agrees that no rocket plume is visible and explains why. Our skeptic Hunchback also has something to say about the blast-off. In this video, he explains that there is something strange about the camera following the rise of the ascent stage and explains why he thinks so. If, as the skeptics believe, there is something unusual about the liftoff, then perhaps it is possible to analyze the rate at which the lunar ascent stage rises. In a paper by Robert A. Breunig, he does just that, using a computer-simulated model. In this simulation, Breunig calculates the height the rocket would reach at each time interval using the ascent stage mass, propellant mass, and engine thrust. The figures he obtained are shown in the above tables. You can see from this table that in the first 2 seconds, the lunar module would have risen less than 4 meters. The skeptics would point out that this is not what we see in the NASA video, as in the first second, the lunar lander ascent stage rises at least 15 meters. Skeptic Lawrence Howlands looks at the blastoff and examines Breuig's table. From this analysis, he concludes that the video can only have been faked by NASA. Howlands did have an email contact with Breyenig and asked him to explain why the video footage does not correspond to all of his careful calculations. Following this contact, Breyenig added a footnote to his paper, which is reproduced here in full. Breyenig's quote: "Launch pad acceleration added 25th March 2016. Since publishing this article in 2009, some conspiracy theorists have used it to claim that the video record of Apollo 17's launch from the surface of the Moon is not authentic. The argument made is that the lunar module is seen to rise off the launch pad with greater acceleration than suggested by the results of this simulation. That is entirely true, but instead of asking why it is true, the conspiracists jump immediately to an explanation they want to be true, i.e., the video is fake. A competent investigator would research other possible explanations for the observation that don't require extraordinary claims, but that's not what we get from the conspiracy theorists. A conspiracist is not interested in seeking the truth. His objective is to find any evidence that seemingly supports his belief while ignoring or rejecting anything that contradicts it. It should be stated that the objective of this simulation was not to precisely recreate the behavior of the lunar module at the moment of liftoff. The goal of the exercise was to see if the LM could attain lunar orbit given its reported mass and propellant load. Any momentary extra push given to the LM at liftoff would have inconsequential effects on the final outcome of the simulation, therefore no attempt was made to simulate the exact liftoff conditions. The opening sequence of the simulation does not compare to the real liftoff launch in terms of velocity and altitude versus time, thus it is expressly unsuitable for the type of analysis performed by the conspiracy theorists. It is telling that no conspiracy theorist had ever asked me about it. So why does the lunar module rise off its launch platform at a seemingly greater than expected acceleration? There are two main contributing factors that come into play. First, when a rocket engine is fired, there is a brief period called the ignition transit, during which the extreme conditions can occur, such as high pressure and temperature peaks. For the LM's ascent engine, the ignition transient lasted for about 350 milliseconds, during which stronger than normal thrust was produced. The second factor can be seen in the illustration to the right back view. Notice that the exit of the ascent engine nozzle sat tight against the upper deck of the ascent engine. On startup, the gas pressure of the nozzle exit rose to higher than normal values due to the constricted flow of exhaust gas. This produced a high degree of transient pressure thrust just at the moment of liftoff. Once the LM climbed high enough that the exhaust could flow from the nozzle unrestricted, the pressure and thrust fell to nominal levels. The factors combined to give the ascent stage a brief but significant spike in the thrust immediately after the engine ignition. This extra kick caused the LM to jump off the launch platform, attaining greater altitude and speed within the first second of flight than otherwise possible, and producing the faster than expected initial climb-out observed in the Apollo 17 video. As explained, this was only a transitory condition, after which the LM's acceleration was constant with the steady-state operation of its ascent engine. Also be advised that time measurements made from internet-posted videos should be considered suspect. Most of these videos have gone through format and framation conversions of unknown type and origin. These manipulations can change the playback speed, rendering the videos unreliable for making time and velocity measurements. End of Breyenig's quote. Basically, what Breyenig is saying is that the computer model was not developed to represent the starting conditions accurately, but rather it was developed for a different purpose, namely to see if the LM could attain lunar orbit given its reported mass and propellant load. Secondly, he questions the use of times from an internet video, as such videos may have gone through format and frame rate conversions of unknown type and origin. In response to these time frame issues, Lawrence Howlands has produced a second video in which he checks the time frame of the video against NASA's log of the launch. He shows that the video times are exactly the same as the NASA log times, so his initial analysis still stands. We have a similar criticism of the blastoff from skeptics Julius A. Birch posted on the AULIS website. He examines the elevation of the ascent stage from Apollo 17 and notes, For the rocket with the same propulsion as Apollo, its reactive control system, RCS, has to be much quicker than that of Apollo, and the resulting orbit insertion trajectory cannot be performed with Apollo's guidance logic. A roller coaster, comprising a jet-propelled cart sliding along tracks pitched so that they can mimic the ascent trajectory, can be constructed that reproduces the broadcast perfectly. In conclusion, he finds that the television broadcast most likely comprised a staged, scaled-down ascent and not an actual LM ascent from the lunar surface.